On July 1st, 1867, this beautiful country was born, not because it was inevitable or because geography demanded it, not because everyone was in agreement of what it should become. It happened because it was an act of imagination. A handful of colonies, divided by language, religion, region, interest, and identity, they decided to attempt something larger than themselves. What they chose was union over drift, compromise over collapse, a country over a collection of colonies. And from that first day, Canada's required prime ministers who could do more than win elections. They had to hold together a country that often seemed easier to pull apart. They had to build railways and institutions, navigate war and depressions, manage Quebec in the West, share a border with the world's greatest economy, welcome newcomers, expand rights. They made decisions that lifted Canada and decisions that in fact harmed Canadians for generations. And that is why this Canada Day conversation matters to you and me.
I hope they walk away with a few things. One of them would be that Canadian history is quite fascinating, pleasantly surprised about some of the achievements of the country. And I hope that they would come away understanding that leadership matters.
My guest today is J.D.M. Stewart. He's the author of The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders and the Nation They Shape. This is personal for me. Before James was an author, historian, commentator, and one of Canada's most thoughtful voices on our political history, he was a teacher at Bishop Strachan School. Both of my daughters were blessed to have him as their history teacher. They did not just learn history from James, they fell in love with it. And that's a rare gift. See, he could take a date and turn it into a decision. He could take a name in a textbook and turn it into a moment of time. He could tell you why that happened and why it still matters today.
The country itself was small, but the vision was big.
And in his book, James opens with a story that should stop every Canadian in their tracks. He's speaking to a group of high school students at the United Nations. Showed him a photograph of Lester B. Pearson, our Nobel Peace Prize winner, former prime minister. Some would say the architect of modern Canada, and no one knew who he was.
Well, nobody really teaches about prime ministers anymore. And that's the comment that really got me going.
Just think about that. We live in a country where many young Canadians know more about American presidents, the founding fathers, politics, and culture than they know about the people who built, broke, repaired, defended, and reimagined Canada. And I'm launching this conversation on Canada Day 2026 at a time when Canada is once again being tested. The world order we relied on is shifting. Our relationship with the United States is under pressure. The economy is anxious. Artificial intelligence is reshaping work and truth. Quebec feels ignored. The West feels alienated. Young people are questioning whether Canada still offers them a future. A significant majority would choose to join the United States if the financial deal made sense. And this very idea of sovereignty, the right to decide our own destiny, is no longer something we can take for granted.
We need to get more people on the same page more often than we do currently so that we can get some of these things done. You can just imagine how hard it is to be a prime minister. I want to get X, Y, and Z done. And then a bureaucrat says, well, we got to line up this, 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 and this. It's incredibly hard, but we have to keep trying.
This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning with memory. Because if we do not know how Canada was made, how can we understand what's at risk? If we do not know that leaders who shaped us, how can we judge the leaders who will shape what comes next? And James does not see our prime ministers as saints. At the same time, he doesn't reduce them to villains. He asks us to see them as human beings, ambitious, flawed, visionary, limited, courageous, cautious, sometimes wrong, sometimes remarkable, but always consequential.
An hour in the office of the prime minister is an hour in the office of the history of the country.
What can the prime ministers of our past teach us about the Canada we need to become? It's Tony Chapman. Thank you for listening to Chatter That Matters, presented by RBC. If you can, please subscribe to the podcast. And ratings and reviews, well, they're always welcome and they're always appreciated. J.D.M. Stewart, author of The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders, and the Nation They Shaped. Welcome to Chatter That Matters.
Great to be here, Tony.
Let's wind the clock back to July 1st, 1867, Canada becoming a country. What was most improbable about the idea that everything that went into this melting pot could become a country?
Well, in 1867, of course, Canada wasn't very big at all. It was just this strip of Ontario and Quebec, plus New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. So the country itself was small, but the vision was big. One province is French-speaking and Catholic, and the other provinces are primarily Protestant and English-speaking. So that was something kind of novel from the very beginning and was obviously going to cause friction down the road. In fact, it still causes friction. So it was an improbable country. That's the way you put it. But I think it would become even more improbable as we expanded.
But let's talk about Macdonald because, his concept of sea to sea, the railway. I mean, right now we're tearing down his statues. We're not really recognizing what he did that was positive and what he made possible.
This is one of my problems with people taking down Macdonald statues, and much of the debate about Sir John A. Macdonald to begin with is that it has become very one track, not a thorough evaluation of someone's legacy. The critics are taking one issue and saying John A. Macdonald, his Indigenous policy was terrible and started residential schools, therefore he must be a terrible person. And then we're just throwing everything out. And that's not really good historical perspective or any way to evaluate any person, both living and dead.
I look at United States, their founding fathers, and how well they've been championed and celebrated, and all of them had flaws. All of them had. Why did the Americans establish their founding fathers as really heroes, and yet we as a country seem to be more concerned about what they did wrong versus the majesty of what they did right?
It may be that the Americans have a culture that is more ready to exalt and have heroes, whereas Canada is less content with heroes, doesn't think it needs them as much. Will sometimes try to knock them down if they have them. It'd be interesting to see the study of why Americans seem to be able to look at someone like Thomas Jefferson and say, yeah, we don't like the fact that he had slaves on one side, but on the other side, we like the fact that he was the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence. So this is the whole idea that two things about a person can be true at the same time. With Sir John A. Macdonald, it can be true that he had the vision and the courage to try to build a nation out of something pretty small and see far enough ahead that a railway to the West Coast would be appropriate. And then at the same time, we can say we don't like his treatment of Indigenous people. Canadians seem very reticent, actually, to really put anyone up on a pedestal. And in some degrees, that's okay because that shows a certain amount of humility and modesty. But on the other hand, it sometimes leads to a lack of ambition or aspiration and appreciation for your past.
So let's move it on to talking about Laurier. I've studied a lot of Canadian history, but I didn't really understand Laurier's role the way you frame it. Moderation, conciliation, what he called the sunny way. So in today's angry, polarized world where it seems that everybody's sitting in their social media castles, liking each other's like-minded content and then firing spitballs at the other side, bring us back to the time where maybe there was a sense of civility and positivity that roared through politics.
I loved his approach, which was devoid of hard edges. It was devoid of take it or leave it. It was about talking, dialogue, finding a solution. Laurier believed in Canada itself, and he added Alberta and Saskatchewan as two new provinces to the country. He was always such a positive force.
He survived today's politics.
I think we could use people who can try to show that there is a different way and that you don't have to be sinking down as everyone else sinks down. You can still go high. And it's important for leaders to show that leaders can still go high. I'm not trying to make prime ministers into saints. The real driving force here is leaders who are trying to make a positive difference for the country.
You're always fascinated by their personalities. And when you write about Mackenzie King, you see what a contradiction. Odd, cautious, morally complicated, yet he was incredibly successful.
Still a bit confounded by Mackenzie King because he wasn't the nicest guy. He wasn't the sort of person that you want to spend extra time with. He was always working. He never married. And in some ways, I think his marriage was Canada itself. He surrounded himself with good people. He let them do their jobs unless he thought they were no longer capable of it. Dedicated to the country, its sovereignty, definitely believed in the potential of what Canada could bring to the world.
So let's now move to the days of Canada where Flag, Medicare, Canada Pension, St. Lawrence Seaway, Trans-Canada Highway. I mean, we were really good at getting stuff done.
Some of it was Louis Saint Laurent, and some of this was Pearson. So Saint Laurent was the infrastructure guy who brought forward the St. Lawrence Seaway and got us in NATO. And Lester B. Pearson, minority governments from 1963 to 1968, got these big jobs done. Medicare being one of the biggest one in the Canadian flag, the most divisive debate in parliamentary history. Perhaps it was his skills as a conciliator, as a diplomat that helped with that. But a lot of people were looking at Pearson with eyes wide open saying, how are you actually doing that? Because this flag debate is going to be a disaster. But he had a vision. We needed a flag like this.
We can't obviously go through every prime minister, but I'm curious, after you've done so much work with it, who do you feel is most misunderstood by Canadians?
Writ large, a lot of people think prime ministers are just trying to build their egos. But I would say all of the prime ministers have been trying to get something done good for the country, as I was saying. But look at somebody like Brian Mulroney. A lot of people didn't like Brian Mulroney's personality when he was prime minister. But then when he died, people were appreciating a lot of the bold government initiatives that he took, and that he was kind of from a bygone era, it almost seemed, because in the 2020s, politicians weren't making bold strokes anymore. It was not the same. The other person who I think was somewhat misunderstood is Stephen Harper, because Stephen Harper, he gives off a bit of a remote vibe as a leader, doesn't really let you in, and seems like he's always calculating. But behind the scenes, he's quite a different fellow. He has a great sense of humor. Enjoys camaraderie. And so there's often a disconnect between the private prime minister and the public prime minister.
Who's the most underrated for the Canada we live in today that really set up sort of the bedrock or the foundation of this country, but really isn't recognized for it?
To me, that answer is Louis Saint Laurent. Louis Saint Laurent was prime minister from 1949 to 57. And this was at a critical time. It was the end of the Mackenzie King era. How are we going to respond to the new world order that's being created out there with a communist bloc settling in? Saint Laurent did these things, signed Canada onto NATO, developed the NORAD agreement, which the Diefenbaker government ended up signing, built the great infrastructure projects, the St. Lawrence Seaway, I think you were alluding to earlier, the Trans-Canada Highway.
These were done in years, not decades upon decades. For a country of, 20 million at that time, that was exceptional infrastructure building.
At the same time, also, he was trying to move Canada. He also appointed the first Canadian Governor General in Vincent Massey. So he was making these little moves towards being more sovereign in the way we talk about ourselves and think about ourselves.
As I'm listening to you, it must frustrate you at times when people dismiss accomplishments of the past by just saying that was a different time, or back then everything was simple, easy to get done. I have to believe they had, it might be different challenges, but the complexity and chaos of running a country is no different today than it was back then.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with you 100% on that, Tony. Like some of these projects would be really challenging and you'd need to marshal great resources, but the whole legal landscape and the treaty landscape and the rights and the environment, like a lot has changed in terms of what you have to be considering before you do any project.
That's fair.
We need to get more people on the same page more often.
Come back. James and I are going to continue our conversation and pay particular note to his thoughts on the referendums and the separation moves that seem to be happening in this country, and why that, in fact, they go back a half a century. And then I'm going to close the show with my love for Canada and some of the things I think we can do to make this beautiful country dream and do.
It's Tony Chapman. Investing in Canada, well, that matters to RBC. $500 billion in sustainable financing to combat climate change. $500 million for Future Launch, a 10-year program to prepare youth for the jobs of tomorrow, helping to discover the next generation of Olympians, artists monetizing their talents, women entrepreneurs pursuing their dreams, supporting mental health, and so much more. Investing in Canada, well, that matters to RBC.
Canada prepares to fly its new flag that will make the maple leaf the popular symbol of the country. At a textile plant in Toronto, mass production is underway to have the first order ready when Queen Elizabeth proclaims it officially. She had already given it verbal sanction on Christmas Eve. Thus, until now, there had been no official Canadian flag. But in a short while, all Canadians will salute their maple leaf forever.
My guest today is J.D.M. Stewart. He's the author of an extraordinary book, The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders and the Nation They Shaped. And what he has to say, I hope, will shape your views on this great country we live in and the leaders that help make it happen. Do you think we've put so much bureaucracy and layers upon layers of wet cement that we can't even get the littlest things done, let alone having the imagination of building a railway coast to coast or the St. Lawrence Seaway? Have we put ourselves in a position that mediocrity is the way forward because we just haven't got permission and an appetite to get things done?
I think there is an appetite, but I also think there has to be a bit more recognition or admitting that these things aren't as easy as we think they are. And maybe a bit more transparency to say, look, if we want to build a pipeline from Alberta to British Columbia, we have to do this kind of environmental assessment. We have this number of First Nations we have to get on board. It's going to cost this kind of money, but also some drive to make sure that it happens too.
I understand. Yes, you need to talk about environmental and the indigenous. All of these things have to be factored in. But if they're simply used as a toll booth or a reason why not, it paints a very different picture. It's almost like the rest of the world must be raising their eyebrows going, you're sitting on more resources than almost any other country on the planet. And yet you got 11 million, 1/4 of your population that stepped into a food bank last year.
It does get a bit discouraging to think about how long it's been since we've really done something incredible that we can all rally behind. And a lot of Canadians are starting to believe it too, because I would say that, we had a government under Justin Trudeau that for a number of years was saying that we're not a great country. Even if it wasn't explicit, it didn't seem to be ambitious that way, except in the area of climate change. I would encourage Prime Minister Mark Carney to continue to kind of dream for Canadians, set the bar high, and get some of the best minds to say, here's things that we can do. And some of them don't have to be infrastructure projects. We could be doing it by promoting other things, like promoting Canadian sovereignty through Canadian books and talking about arts projects and things like this that build a bit of cohesion. But, he's holding that big economic summit in the fall of people gathering in Toronto to talk about world economics and projects. So it's not easy, and I think it is a lot harder than it used to be.
I wasn't really going to touch on this, but let's talk about the two Trudeaus, arguably the most polarizing prime ministers in our history. So let's start with the dad, Pierre. When we first walked off the airplane in Bonn with his rose in his lapel and his long hair, we thought we had a rock star. Canada had an identity, a personality. But I would say that during his tenure, we saw a country that was becoming more and more divided in terms of East and West and French and English.
It was an exciting time when Pierre Trudeau became prime minister in 68. And that was the period of Trudeau-mania, which some of your listeners will remember. But the bloom fell off that rose pretty quickly because in the 1972 election, the Trudeau Liberals just won a minority government. You knew where he stood on most issues. And if you didn't like it, he was willing to spar with you, take an issue to the ballot box and see what happens. So he did have the courage of his convictions. And the country was divided, for sure, particularly from the West, with oil-producing, resource-oriented provinces and the rest of Canada. And plus the whole idea of bringing in official bilingualism, that created its own record of division. But the one thing people did appreciate about Pierre Trudeau is that he at least spoke his mind and wasn't trying to speak out of two sides of his mouth. When Pierre Trudeau passed away in 2000, there were hundreds of thousands of people that went to Ottawa to pay respects to his casket lying in state at the center of the Parliament building. So there was an appreciation, if not a love for him as well.
His son comes along carrying the Trudeau name and gets fast-tracked into the leadership. How would you mark his time as a prime minister?
As a historian, Tony, the first thing I have to say is that it's a little bit early to be putting the stamp on his prime ministership. We're still trying to figure out what we think of Brian Mulroney's prime ministership 30 years after it ended. But we can talk about some of the early tracks. And he was also a prime minister that left office very unpopular. We talked about the divisions that Pierre Trudeau created, and even Brian Mulroney was divisive too. And there's some similarities between Trudeau, Justin, and Brian Mulroney because they were both big personalities that kind of liked the adulation of the masses. And this, I think, was part of the reason why Trudeau fell out of favor, is people were tired of listening to him because he did do a bit of preaching and moralizing. He was apologizing a lot for things that happened in Canadian history, or he was saying Canada was great, but there would always be an asterisk. And he said famously, Canada has no core identity. And I think that really ticked a lot of people off. And he's never been able to live it down or try to correct that statement. So he's not been a successful prime minister. I think that could change over time as we look at the issue of climate change isn't going anywhere. And Justin Trudeau staked a lot of his political capital on climate change. The issue of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, that's not going anywhere. Justin Trudeau staked a lot of his political capital on that issue. So there's a lot to sift through over the next 20 to 30 years to see what we think of the Justin Trudeau years.
James, I was born in Quebec. I was part of the English exodus out of Quebec in 1979. I had a lot of empathy for the French. I mean, the old expression was, the English own the breweries, we drink the beer. I often painted it towards how powerful the church was in Quebec for many years as the reason why a lot of Quebecers weren't encouraged to do more. And I think Duplessis with the separating the church and state, but we still had separation. We came very close to losing Quebec. And I'd say now in 2026, we cannot deny 400,000 people from Alberta have signed a petition to debate their referendum and independence. So talk to me about first Quebec. What can we learn from that? And how can we take some of that learning to make sure that both Quebec and Alberta continue to be part of this great country?
One thing that underlines both of these questions is the importance of understanding your country and understanding your history. Because that Quebec referendum, the second one, is over 30 years ago. And the first one is almost 50 years ago. So most of the younger population doesn't have any recollection of this at all. And so this is why, another reason why I think it's important for people to read books like mine is to have an understanding that there are roots to this. And the roots go back to before Confederation. And the same thing with Western separatist feelings. Western alienation, it didn't just get invented under Jason Kenney or Danielle Smith. This goes back to the 1920s. And some of the early third parties that were in Parliament, like the Progressive Party, won the second most seats in the 1921 election. And they were a collection of Western farmers and Ontario farmers who were unhappy with the decisions of coming out of central Canada. So we have to have a patience and an understanding for these issues. And we also need to be able to debate them on their merit, because I don't think there is a strong case for Quebec or Alberta to leave Confederation, the Confederation of one of the greatest countries in the world. Is there room to try to make the Confederation better? Yes. But I think it's really important that people walking around saying, oh, I wonder what's going on in this debate. Well, you kind of have to educate yourself a little bit on some of the historical issues that have plagued both of these provinces. They're two quite different ones as well. Quebec, very much a cultural and linguistically based movement and trying to control their own cultural destiny on a continent of 400 or 500 million people. Alberta, it's very much more a grievance between Alberta separatists and not just separatists, the Alberta government and the relationship with the federal government in Ottawa, which really deteriorated under the leadership of Justin Trudeau.
A striking number of young Canadians, would consider becoming American if the price was right. So in other words, my future is no longer guaranteed. This Canadian dream has disappeared. Access to jobs, affordable housing, this great negative cloud that social media has put over all of us. How do we get them to believe in this country again?
One of the things that teaches us is that economics are extremely important. And the economic agenda hasn't really focused on young people for a long time, if ever, because it always seems to be focused on the older set of demographics. And I think younger people have finally realized that they're kind of getting the short end of the stick, which I would say they probably are. I would spend some political capital addressing their needs, which are significant. At the same time, we haven't done a great job of showing young people how dynamic the country is historically and culturally. We live next door to the biggest cultural juggernaut in the United States. It dominates a lot of what comes across a young person's phone. In schools, I think we need to do a better job of telling the story of Canada through not just history class, but also, in your English class. Are you reading English Canadian novels or French Canadian novel in translation? And celebrate the country. We just spent the last 10 years. In the 10 years after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there was a lot of newspaper stories and political commentary about Canada not being a great country. We can still recognize the wrongs, but we can still say this is one of the greatest countries in the world. I'd like to hear a little bit more of that kind of talk coming from various leaders across the country.
So if young Canadians read your book, what do you hope they walk away?
A few things. One of them would be that Canadian history is quite fascinating, pleasantly surprised about some of the achievements of the country. And I hope that they would come away understanding that leadership matters. I would hope they say, I want to pick up another book on Canadian history and I want to delve deeper into that topic there on Expo 67, or I want to read more about what happened with some of the environmental water treaties or some of the arts groups that were formed, or I just want to dig further into a biography of somebody like Wilfrid Laurier. So a nice springboard into a further interest in Canadian history would be my hope.
James, I always end my podcast with my 3 takeaways. And the first is I hope a lot of people take away what you talked about today. And that is we look at our prime ministers and we tend to frame them and label them, even more so now. I love Carney or I hate Carney. But the reality is they're human beings. And as you said, most of them stepped up to serve and build a better Canada. They often had to do it wading through the cement of the days, whether that was Britain, United States, tariffs, Quebec seeking independence. Many of them found a way to keep moving forward. Some even ran through that cement. And certainly when you look at how Canada was created, we've done some remarkable things. The second thing is the interesting is the attributes of a leader. And I wonder if they have changed over time. I think that time has changed in terms of what we talked about is the bureaucracy and the many things you have to check off before you get things going. But, you need courage, you need conviction, you need capability, you need your ability to compromise, collaborate, and you need to have this, these shining eyes in the sense that we can dream and we can do it. And let's hope that as we vote for our leaders in the future, we look for those attributes in them. I guess the final thing is, the word history almost tends to timestamp things and make people go, do I really need to learn that? Hearing the passion in your voice, and I am a lover of history as well, I think the more we can learn about where we came from, to understand that the rings on the tree called Canada that began in 1867, and each of those rings represents a year, and within those years, a lot went on. And the more we understand that, I think the more we can appreciate why there is really no country like Canada, that it is our time to seek possibility and positivity and to create a country where we're less dependent on borrowing money to make our way forward and much more focused on growing our way forward. And as you said, with culture and creativity and commerce and enterprise and all the magical things that give a country and the people who live their purpose. So I really appreciate you joining me on Chatter That Matters.
My pleasure to be here, Tony. Thanks for the great conversation.
What I now want to talk about is Canada. I'm not happy where we are as a country. We seem divided and distracted. Too many are living paycheck to paycheck. For them and many others, Canada is no longer affordable or a place to dream and do. I mean, we all love to hear that we're the best place to live and we're wrapped and protected by a blanket of care. But is it fair to say that it's our borrowed dollars and excessive taxation that have been woven together to create this blanket? Next year, our interest payments for the debt owed by our federal and provincial governments will be over $68 billion. This is money that should go to healthcare and education and our defense. And each year, more debt is piled on and more interest is paid. Canada needs to grow, not borrow our way forward. We need to drastically reduce the number of dollars that go into running our many levels of government. We need to free up more dollars working for Canadians in Canada. We need to improve our productivity and foster and fuel a made-in-Canada economy versus subsidizing a branch plant mentality. And with so much commerce happening in the clouds, we need to invest in our innovators and keep them in Canada versus having them drain into other countries. We need to maintain our leadership in AI, be the leaders in tech for nature. Why not own longevity and become the country where research and commercialization is done to keep people living healthier and longer? We need to pick the lanes where we can be a superpower. Can we not become the country that our allies look to for ethically sourced food and the environmentally forward harvesting of our resources? Canadians populate Hollywood. Can we not tap into our creativity to create content and gaming for the world? And Canada must treat immigration as our strategic advantage, not some random number. We need to understand how many people will we need given our job losses and the automation of task work. And our infrastructure and social services, are they set up to support them? Can best serve our calling for a growth-oriented economy while preserving our democracy and values. We only have 40 million people to feed and vast intellectual, emotional, and natural resources to harness and harvest. Let's work to earn our way forward and to create the next chapter of Canada, one that's tolerant, democratic, resourceful, and productive. Because the future of Canada and the future of our youth, and you are my future, deserve this. Once again, a special thanks to RBC for supporting Chatter That Matters. It's Tony Chapman. Thanks for listening, and let's chat soon.